this video, we're going to learn about the names and symbols of some of the most commonly known elements, as well as how they are classified as either metals, non-metals, or metalloids. Now, the properties of metalloids obviously fall between those of metals and non-metals, but I didn't have space on my board, so I've just squeezed them in the corner here. The numbers that I've given on my board are the atomic number of each element, which obviously give the number of protons in its nucleus. Now, the symbols of some of the elements are quite logical based on their English name, but some are going to be classified based on their Latin names, and I'm going to try and show you those as we go along. Let's start with the metals. So lithium and beryllium are going to be based on the first two letters of their name. So lithium is going to be Li, beryllium is going to be Be. Sodium is the first funny one that comes from its Latin name, and the Latin name for sodium is natrium. So I'm going to try and squeeze it in here. Natrium, and obviously that Na is what gives us the symbol of natrium. So there you go. Now, magnesium, and I'm going to jump to manganese, are quite interesting. So in a lot of instances, the symbol of the element is simply the first letter of the English name. However, and that's very often true for when elements were discovered early on. But for elements that were discovered after that, they needed to now use further letters to distinguish between different elements. So an example of this is manganese and magnesium. So magnesium and manganese have both got M as their first letter and A as their second letter. So they then go on to the third letter to differentiate between them. So magnesium, for example, is Mg, while manganese is Mn. So just by saying the name, you can actually figure out what the symbol is going to be. Aluminium is just Al. A lot of the time, chemists will use a little curly L or a cursive L to denote it so that it doesn't just look like a capital I. Otherwise, it looks like you're saying artificial intelligence. So sometimes it's a good idea to use a little curly L instead so it doesn't look like a capital I. Potassium is one of the other ones that is named from its Latin name, and that is kalium. So kalium is obviously then given the symbol K. And calcium is just going to be Ca again. So capital C, small a, titanium, capital T, small I. Iron is one of those with a Latin name, and that is ferrum, which is Fe. I remember this by thinking of a Ferris wheel, like you would see at a fun fair, or like the Big Eye in London, and that will be primarily made of iron. So I always think Ferris wheels are made primarily of iron, and then I remember the Fe, and that helps me to remember the symbol. Okay, cobalt is Co, and nickel is Ni. Now these three I just want to mention specifically in that these three are going to be the ferromagnetic elements, and that is meaning that they are the ones that are going to be primarily forming magnets. So in magnetic elements, you are very likely to find either in combination or individually iron, cobalt, and nickel. And they are next to each other on the periodic table, so they're quite easy to remember. But another way, it sounds like a pasta, but I always think of it like Facconi. It sounds like a pasta should be named after that, but those three are going to be the magnetic ones. All right, next one is copper. Copper is another one that is from its Latin name, and that is cuprum. Another way to remember it is like we say cop for a policeman. You can say the copper says, I see you, don't run too far. So that's another way of remembering it. Zinc, instead of being Zi, they use Zn. For that, capital Z, small n. Silver, it comes from argentum. That's the old name for it, which is the A and the G there. So that's where silver comes from. Silver happens to be one of my favorite metals, but for a lot of people, the thought is that it's a low quality metal, so you can remember it as ach shame, it's only silver. Tin comes from stannum, and so there's the S and the N, but you can remember it. Tin rhymes with sin, and the S and the N and the T and the N, you can remember those together. Platinum comes from PT. If you follow the logic from our silver, oh shame it's only silver, platinum is worth a lot more, so you can think you've got to do a lot of PT to get the same worth of platinum. Gold is AU, and that comes from aurum. AU for aurum. You can think the copper says, AU, I see you stealing that gold. Mercury comes from hydrogyrum. I'm just going to do that in 2 lines. Hydra, which sounds like water. And the gyrum is referring to the metal part. So that comes from Hg. The reason why the Latins gave it the name hydrogyrum is because it looks like a liquid, because mercury is the only metal which is a liquid at room temperature. Lead comes from plumbum. Fun name to say. Plumbum with P and the B, and so that's where the symbol comes from for lead. Okay, now let's have a look at the 2 metalloids that I've got. Obviously there are a lot more metalloids, they're all along the steps of the periodic table, but these are just the 2 that come up in the first 20 elements of the table, so I thought we would do those first. Boron is just straightforward B from its name, and silicon is just Si from its name as well. So those 2 are quite easy to remember. Most of the metalloids are. Now we can have a look at the non-metals, and again, as I mentioned just now, most of the elements that were discovered early on, their symbol was just came from the first letter of their name, and that was true for a lot of the non-metals because they are a lot more abundant in terms of the air that we breathe and the environment around us. So that's why many of these are actually just going to be a single letter, and they're quite a bit easier to remember. Okay, for example, hydrogen is just a straightforward H from the first letter of the name. Helium, however, the H was already taken, so now we need to go to the next letter, and so it becomes He. Carbon is just straightforward C, nitrogen N, oxygen O, fluorine F. So all of those are simply the first letter of the name. Neon now, the N was already taken in nitrogen, so now we need to go to the next letter, so we go Ne. Phosphorus is just a straightforward P. Be careful, it sounds like phosphorus, so it sounds like it's an F, but remember that PH is an F sound, but the name is actually written with a P, so don't forget to give that symbol a P, not an F. Sulfur is just a straightforward F. Just to note that the American spelling is Sulfur. That's also absolutely okay. That's acceptable. Chlorine is going to be the C and the L. Again, like we said with the aluminium, where you do the curly L just so it doesn't look like an I. That's always a good idea for chlorine. And then argon, we're going to do AR. That's the other one of the noble gases. Argon and neon are both noble gases. Bromine comes from the first 2 letters, Br, and iodine comes from that first letter, iodine. So there you go, some of the more commonly known elements on the periodic table, by no means all of them, but just many of them that you need to get to know the names of and have a good understanding before you start looking at the periodic table in detail.